Good evening and welcome. I think based on the number of Plath scholars in the audience and the near encyclopedic knowledge of our speaker this evening, I think I'll confine my remarks to some background info about the series itself and our thinking behind it. I'll begin with a quote from Anne Sexton, who says, "My typewriter writes, it doesn't break the way it warned." When instruments work, Heidegger observes, they become almost imperceptible to ourselves and to our culture. The hammer becomes an extension of the hand, he says. The typewriter, the computer, likewise. But when the hammer breaks, he says, it presents itself as a problem, or I would say as a possibility, a vital pause, a catalyzing conundrum. At Houghton Library, there's a room called the Dead Typewriter Room, though when you ask anyone what's in it, few can say. Nor can anyone seem to recall when the door was last opened, though I note the moniker is dead, as in once lived and not broken. Tonight, in your presence, we open that door through a new series we're calling Typewriter Talks, in honor of the recent donation of John Ashbery's 1946 Royal typewriter to the Poetry Room, the same model, I think, that Sylvia Plath used at Smith College in the early 1950s, and about which Amanda Golden will no doubt tell you more. To Ashbery and Plath's generation, Marcia McLuhan observes, the typewriter offered a dynamic and intimate synergy of eye, ear, and hand. But the instrument also situated in writers in what scholar Martin Lyons describes as, quote, an immediate confrontation at the point of creation with their own writing in print, forcing a whole generation to see their work in a critical light. In this series, we're using the typewriter as a jumping off point to ask larger questions about how we as makers, thinkers, beings, and bodies intersect with, are changed by, catalyze, and act as agents of change, transformation, and creation in the face of the dominant technologies and the guiding paradigms and constructs of our time. At the time of Sylvia Plath's first visit to our library, she described it as, quote, the quiet sanctum of the poetry room, though it was far from quiet. As the first library of voices in the country, it was filled with popular phonograph stations and a clamorous typewriter, rowdy conversations, and live poetry and folk music performances. What made it quiet on that day in June 1958 was the fact that it was only in the summer, when the bulk of the male students were gone, that women were allowed to enter the library, except, of course, for the secretary, the female typist. In a recording made a few years later in the early 1960s, Buckminster Fuller shared a few of his thoughts about the mid-century generation into which Plath emerged. He describes not only the increased automation and impersonality in their surroundings, changes that were concomitant, of course, with the rising interest in personality and modern psychology, but a society that seemed to him to be unprepared for or unwilling to integrate breakdown or precarity into its way of thinking. When things like cars, phonographs, and typewriters were invented, Fuller recalls, it was understood that it was in the very nature of materials and of beings to break. Breakage was the norm, smooth sailing the aberration. And he suggests that it was this rupture that opened us to a better understanding of our material entanglements, our mechanical confidence, and our shared finitude and mortality, and gave his generation, and he hoped the next, and ours, renewed respect for how things are made, as well as their unmaking, their place in a cycle, encouraging a curiosity and humility about processes and not just the shiny, happy products of post-war America. Process was definitely a large part of the zeitgeist into which my own generation in turn emerged. In 1972, the word writing process, a phrase embedded into tonight's event, was formally coined. And shortly thereafter, the phrase word processor came into being. That same year, the philosopher Stanley Cavell wrote that we have reduced the dimensionality of the verb to write. To his mind, every activity undertaken, for instance, by Thoreau at Walden was a form of writing. To build, to plant, to listen, to swim, to rest, to read, to question, and to protest was to write. This evening, we are honored to welcome Amanda Golden, a scholar who has dedicated her days, and it would seem most nights, to the fullest fathoming of what it means to write, both materially and metaphysically, and to authors like Plath, who have activated all of its verbs. In her previous work on the material practices of such writers as Virginia Woolf and Anne Sexton, and in her current expansive and breathtaking effort to compile and co-edit the poems of Sylvia Plath, a scholarly edition that will include the largest aggregate, I think, to date, of the author's variants and drafts. Golden has dedicated herself to restoring the dimensionality and doing justice to the complexity of the creative act and of those who have been so bold and blazing as to undertake it. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Golden. Her full bio is in the Zoom chat.
Thank you so much, Christina. And thank you everyone who have come and come from so far. I see so many friends from all over and I'm so honored. It's so honored in particular to have been invited. Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Harvard. I took a course at Harvard Summer School in 1999, a Shakespeare course with Marjorie Garber, and I could have never anticipated that over 20 years later, I'd be here. Plath too went to Harvard Summer School, and I was very excited when I learned that. She went there in 1954, and I'll be talking a little bit about that period, but it's an important setting for Plath because she was raised in the Boston area. She was born in Boston and then moved to Winthrop and then to Wellesley. And her mother taught secretarial skills at Boston University. And Catherine Rankovich's here, and she's the preeminent scholar on Aurelia Plath. So, so feel free to chime in the chat, as can anyone else throughout. I look forward to hearing what you all have to say in the chat. So Boston and Harvard loom large in Plath's writing life. Her journal that she wrote in college was from the Harvard Coop. She later wanted another one and asked her mother to look into it. So her very intimate thoughts were on Harvard paper from the start. And then her father also received one of his master's degrees from Harvard in 1925, and her brother went to Harvard. So it was a big part of her sense of Boston and intellectual life. And it continued to be as she lived in Boston, and I'll talk more about some of the details, but I was sharing some of these details with Christina when we first met. For instance, when she moved to Cambridge, the other Cambridge, England in 1956, she told her mother that the River Cam is about as wide as Linnaean Street. For some of you locals, I thought you would like that. And then later on, when she moved to Boston to write for the year, she kept taking on side hustles because she needed more stimulation for her writing and in general. And one of them was working in Widener Library for what was then the chairman of this Department of Sanskrit and Indian Studies, David Henry Holmes Ingalls. And she wrote to her friend that she spends she spends time in the shadowy stacks of Widener 2 or 3 afternoons a week. And that time period is part of what I think inspired her poem Purda, in part because Ingalls shared offprints of Sanskrit poetry with her, and that was when she also read A Passage to India. So a brief Harvard orientation to Plath, and thank you again. And I'll be showing some other features of Harvard's collections throughout the talk, or referring to them. So I wanted to start with an image. I'm going to share my slides. And can you see them all right? All good? Okay. I have it to the side so I can still see you all because then it won't feel as much like a void. Just enlarging you all. Okay, so I'm going to start with some slides of that are in my book, Annotating Modernism, which so it doesn't flicker as much. It just came out in paperback, and it's about class reading and teaching strategies. And I wanted to start with that because my immersion in Plath's creative writing life in part is grounded in her library and her archive and her teaching materials. I started visiting Smith 20 years ago, well, more than 20 now, in 2001. And I started with the manuscripts, drawing on the work of scholars like Susan Van Dyne and Tracy Brains. The other Sylvia Plath had been published, introducing readers to the ways that Plath wrote on pink paper, which I'll talk more about, and I would work through the manuscripts. And eventually I started reading widely in Plath's library because it seemed as if the marginalia had not been fully addressed as contents of Plath's archive. Often the marginalia were pointed to for various reasons, but I wanted to understand them more cohesively. So I would read the books in Plath's library and then read along with the marginalia and make my own copies of Plath's books by copying the marginalia into new copies. So this was sort of this fascinating immersion in Plath. And along the way, I was working in the Lilly Library in Indiana University, and I found this photograph from Plath's scrapbook. I wanted to tell you too that Smith holds the materials from Ted Hughes and some materials from Aurelia Plath and some related materials from Plath's friends. Those are in the Smith College Special Collections. The Lilly Library holds materials that Aurelia Plath placed there largely from before Plath returned to England in 1959. So they hold about half of her books. They hold her teaching materials. They hold her childhood work. There's also work elsewhere, like at the Morgan Library, but they hold a lot of things that remained with Aurelia Plath. They also hold materials that Plath sold in her lifetime. That was a real turning point. At one point, a dealer bought some of Ted Hughes's materials. And then in 1959 in London, Plath sold some of her materials to a dealer who placed them in the Lilly Library. And that, as my co-editor Karen Kukio likes to point out and taught me, that taught Plath that her materials had value. And that was when she started making a more concerted effort to date things and remember things, and making it easier for us to retrace her steps. But she had a different material relationship to her materials once they had more than monetary value. So this picture, to return, is in her scrapbook at the Lilly Library, and it's from her senior year at Smith. And to me, it was fascinating because it shows her library in part, how she arranged it, and those books are at Smith and the Lilly Library, and some are also at Emory as part of Ted Hughes's library. You see what she called her Harvard armchair, which has a pennant across the back, and I was going to quote from a letter that has that later on that she was sending to one of her boyfriends who was at Harvard. In these photographs, you see another sizable portion of her library, and her desk, which includes her Smith Corona typewriter, which I'll list her typewriters in order. Thanks to Peter Steinberg for helping me. And that was the typewriter that she used during her later years at Smith. One other item I wanted to show you is in the upper left-hand corner. And some of you may know what this is. Feel free to chime in the chat. I'll give you a minute to think and guess to yourself. It is a sculpture of Plath's own head. Of course. So Plath had a friend who, for an art class, made a sculpture of Plath, and you can see she has sort of her signature, what Linda Bunsen called her Veronica Lake hairstyle, is visible here. You can almost imagine a sort of cocked eyebrow. And I made a detailed photograph here, so you could see a little sharper. But this is the only remaining photograph of it because when Plath left for England the following year, she went to Newnham College, Cambridge, and she took with her an enormous amount of her books and her clothes. And she brought her earthenware head with her too, because when one travels abroad, you bring a sculpture of your own head, and Plath is amazing like that. And so Plath brought this sculpture with her, and then Ted Hughes had other ideas. He, in 1957, in the quote that I've put here from the letters, I'm going to introduce some quotes from the letters throughout, and so you can see at the bottom where they come from with the handy Kindle quotes. But he suggested leaving it in a tree. That's excellent plan. So they left it in a tree, and she wrote a poem about it. Materials not only surrounded Plath's workspace and shaped her writing process and were a space that she actively curated for herself, but they were also subjects for her work, as were episodes and incidents. And she would make so many excursions or things she had seen into starting points for poems. And The Earthenware Head was one of them. And a typescript for this poem is in the Harvard Library, and it bears the title, The Earthenware Head. You can read about her sending that typescript to Jack Sweeney, then curator of the Lamont Poetry Room, in the letters. She went on to make 2 recordings for Harvard at Stephen Fassett's Boston studios on 13 June and 22 February 1959, the first being at the end of her year teaching at Smith, which she was in Cambridge, and then she came back and she taught at Smith. And along the way, she met Jack Sweeney, and then she recorded her work that June, and then again the following February when she and Hughes had moved to Boston. So those important moments are enshrined in Harvard. And below, I added one detail that I thought was incredibly interesting, because in my book, I talk a lot more about Plath's education, and Elizabeth Drew was her teacher for modernism and one of the formative figures in her education, and also one of my introductions to Plath's education and education at Smith was through Elizabeth Drew's teaching notes that she or someone placed in the Smith College archives, which contain these voluminous notes for lectures that they were used over time, so you can't tell what the lectures may have actually contained. But for me as a graduate student, I thought these lecture notes were incredibly interesting, and they were all on modernist writers. And it was like being transported back to the 50s at Smith. And then I was able to match some spots in the lecture notes to things Plath noted in her margins for those books. Even though, as I've said, you can't tell exactly what she said, you can see some points of intersection from the time. So Elizabeth Drew was formative to me, and I was excited to learn that she also had a history with Jack Sweeney, and he had collaborated with her on an early book called Directions in Modern Poetry. And I put a link below to this article, which was from 1956, that sort of situates him in Plath's moment or a little before. So to shift gears a little bit to the pink paper, which I know you all came to hear about. Plath had pink paper that she stole while she was a teacher at Smith College in 1958. To me, it signifies some of her accomplishment, that she had been invited back, as she had accomplished so much as a student, and so much of Plath's sense of literature is entwined with her identity as a student. Her identity as a student and her success as a student shapes so much of her perspective as a writer. It changes over time, but it's a very strong part of her success. And I think when she was invited back to Smith to teach, even though it was incredibly stressful and exhausting, it was also an accomplishment. And so using this paper, it was part because it was pink, she liked the texture, it was free, and it also was, she had ostensibly taken it to motivate herself. In the passage on the left, she had been struggling to write a novel for several years. She envisioned it being about a student abroad of her, it was sort of a Cambridge novel. And she wasn't successful in following through. So she thought, oh, maybe this pink paper will inspire me. And so she stole a whole pile of it. And she went on to keep writing on this pink paper, drafting the bell jar on one side and then the Ariel poems on the other. And she used it for other things too. You can see in some of the letters that Peter Steinberg and Karen Kutile have noted where she's using the pink paper, and she'll use the like to and from of memorandum paper, sometimes in humorous ways as well. But it gives it a seriousness and officialness of that of the office, that of the supply, that of official memoranda. And on the right, there's a passage where she was writing to a friend of hers, or a sometimes friend of hers from Cambridge, whom she had nominated to take her place at Smith. After she left, after she had decided she was not returning to Smith to teach, she suggested to her friend that she might be interested and put her name forward for the position. And I love that she says here the unofficial prelude, because she's writing on official paper. And she says that the powers that be at Smith, and they're very, very powerful, should be writing you sooner and are very interested. So she's very playful, but you know Plath was someone who read and wrote on many levels. So she gets all of these implications of using the materials she used. She later needed more of this paper. And as some of you may know, she wrote to her teacher, Alfred Young Fisher. She was sending him a copy of her book, The Colossus. And she said, oh, by the way, could you please send me some more of these papers? My muse is mad for them. And she asked for about a dozen. And we learned just now that there was 100 sheets each. So that would have stocked her for a long time. And this is June, and October is the month that really is the month of the Ariel poems. So it's almost as if she knew to get ready. And you can see this paper at Smith. You can also see some of it online. The British Library has scanned a few pages, or included scans of a few pages of the bell jar second draft, and this is a small snippet from it. And you can view them yourself here. You can also view an outline for the bell jar, which is at Smith, and it's handwritten on the pink paper. It's folded, and Plath uses nearly every inch of the page. It's handwritten, and it has check marks by the chapters she completed for the second half of the novel. It also has some notes about other things, like who to send the Knopf editions of the Colossus to. And then at the top, she actually has some things she didn't even get to, that she didn't end up using for the bell jar. So it's a very interesting artifact, and you can see how she uses the space of the page on the pink paper too. So typewriters, the other topic that you've all come here to think more about. So Plath's typewriter, this typewriter, the Royal, is at Smith. This is the typewriter she used during her first 3 or so years of college, for early college years. I like in particular that it has a trademark magic margin, because I like Plath's marginalia. Also, it does not have, and some of you may be familiar with this kind of typewriter, and may even want to volunteer your recollections. But I did not know until Christina was discussing typewriters with me that it did not include an exclamation point. As a matter of course, typewriters did not include at this time exclamation points. They did include a question mark, as you can see. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but around here there's a question mark. But the exclamation point was a multi-step operation involving an apostrophe, a backspace, and a period. Some of you may remember doing this yourself, but I found that incredibly interesting for reasons that I'll tell you about in a bit, because Plath was fond of exclamation points, but they were extra work, even though Plath was no stranger to extra work.
Amanda, May I interrupt just
Sure.
on the topic of technology and its constraints? Some people are saying that this Zoom screen is getting cut off a little, and I'm
Oh, I'm
so
sorry.
sorry
Yeah,
to
that's
interrupt.
my fault.
I just don't want anyone to miss anything. I didn't
I
know.
wanted to see you all, and I slid over my I slid
Could
over my
people tell
screen.
us in the chat if that helps moving it over a little?
Do you see it now? Now it's good. Okay.
Oh, great. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted
Oh, no, that's perfect.
to. Okay,
Thanks.
now I will mute.
The other thing that this typewriter lacks is a 1 key. Some of you may know that too. I did not know that. It doesn't have a 1 key. Plath would use the L as a lowercase for a 1, and it worked fine. But that's an interesting dimension as well that would have been commonplace, just as it's commonplace for us to use some Control C or whatnot. We do multi-step things too without even thinking of them. So this is a breakdown of Plath's typewriters, and I also put Peter Steinberg's blog, which has more visuals, and also the Bonham's listing, so you could see the final typewriter that Plath used that was recently sold. But the first one was the Royal, and then she also used it again when she returned to America after England. Then she brought the smaller Smith Corona that was on her desk in the early picture to England. She then sold it in England because she was seeking an Olivetti. So she sought her mother's help because her mother knew typewriters and taught secretarial skills, and purchased an Olivetti. And in the letters, you can see that Peter Steinberg and Karen Cuccio actually found the ad that Plath placed, because Peter is like the best detective ever, and found the ad. So Plath sold it, and you can read all about it. Unfortunately, we don't know where that typewriter is. Maybe it'll show up someday, and someone who bought that ad will connect all the dots. But this is the sequence of her typewriters. The Royal is the biggest, and she mentions that at times too. Or she refers to its substance. It's very big, and when they bring it out at Smith, it's in a big box. But the others were all portables, like in the advertisement for this event. It was with a portable, you could take it out to the moors, as Plath did. So I collected some examples from Plath's letters of when she's animating her typewriters or describing their materiality, because the typewriter for her did have a real presence. It was something she spent a lot of time on, like we spend a lot of time on our laptops or desktops, but not to the same extent because she wasn't watching TV on it. But it was certainly a presence for her, particularly because of her mother's relation to typewriting. It was a presence in her home, and something that she learned early. But she also gave it additional presence, partly to engage the person she was writing to. She does not give this same animation to her typewriter in her journals that I've noticed. It tends to be in her letter because she's entertaining someone. So when she's writing to Eddie Cohen, who was, he had sent her, some of you know this, but he sent her a fan letter early on in her career when he read her work in 17. And then they both had a correspondence for some time. And she says, the very three-dimensional feel of this typewriter has a calming effect. It says, I'm here, you can still hold to me. And this was early in her time at Smith. September 1950 was in the opening weeks of college, and maybe maybe early on in her use of this typewriter. Later, though, there are some instances in 1954, which is much later. It's after she has her breakdown that she depicts in the bell jar. And depending on who she's writing to and why she's writing, she gives the typewriter different roles. So in her letter to Gordon Lemire, while she is attending Harvard Summer School, she gives the typewriter the role of something of a medium, and thinks about it almost as a presence between her and the letter and the recipient. She's typing something private to the recipient, and then she says, how private are typewriters anyway? Mine is more dear and intimate to me than quill or parchment. And then to another boyfriend, John Rosenthal, later that year, she says she's no longer able to write by hand. It is above and beyond the call of duty, and I think better on a typewriter. there was a tension in typewriting. There's an article by Adam Jernigan where he talks about Plath and typewriting, and also Plath and pink paper, and what he calls the pink collar subtext of the bell jar being the secretarial world. But there's a tension in typewriting brought out by things like Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which were automatic writing. And so here it's almost interesting because she's endowing the process with the thoughts that people are sort of skeptical of, like they're skeptical of AI or bots or machines being more taking over. The idea of the automatic hand in the wasteland was one that intertwined the typist and the machine, that made the woman mechanistic and monotonous and not human. So it's interesting the way she is fusing, giving the typewriter an extension of her creative abilities. It's her, she's in charge. She's not a machine. She just admires her machine, though sometimes her machine's a bit judgy. And that's what these passages are about. Gordon Lemire and Plath had an interesting correspondence, a very long correspondence. And she could be somewhat playful in her letters to him. She would give headers to the letters saying, she would give them different names. Like he was in the Navy, so she would say, to the ancient mariner from Alice in Wonderland. And she would do this throughout. And so she was very playful with him. So I think that in part inspired the playfulness that gave rise to the title of this talk that's in this passage, that she's sitting down and facing the green keys of my smug typewriter, which every time I procrastinate and start a letter gives a small malicious laugh. Then in the next, later on that night, she actually recycles the image, like that malicious typewriter was so great, I'm gonna tell it again. So she writes to her brother and she says, the hardest part of writing is writing. She's a bit more grave here, giving some advice to her brother, kind of being more on the level. I invent any excuse to procrastinate, and whenever I put off story plots to write a letter, your smug typewriter gives a low malicious chuckle. And that my to your is interesting. I don't know, Peter would probably know, but I haven't checked if she was borrowing Warren's typewriter there and referred to it as my to Gordon and your to Warren because it wasn't hers. But I'm not sure. Sometimes she did use Warren's typewriter, but I'm not sure that day. More perhaps when she was visiting home. So I wanted to tell you a little bit, not sure how I'm doing on time. I wanted to tell you a bit about exclamation points. So Plath was a reader who annotated, as I talked about in my book. She was an immersive reader. She had no hesitation writing in books, so some people do. And exclamation points were a frequent part of her engaging with reading. And I was pulling some examples because I think it's interesting that the exclamation point was a multi-step process in type and an intuitive reaction without multi-step in marginalia. And I think the two are connected in the sense of tone that she uses in both instances. But just a little intro to Plath's reading practices. This is one passage she noted, Dubliners, and the description of Gabriel Conroy's loving to feel the covers of books and turning over the pages of new books is a lot, it tracks with how Plath read herself. And the next passage echoes it, although it's a year later, when she's writing to Philip McCurdy, another boyfriend who was a Harvard student. And she says, I'm ensconced in my Harvard crimson armchair. And she's smelling all the new books she had brought back in this buying binge she went on, and is so excited about these books. And then in the passage to the right, she becomes engrossed with D.H. Lawrence's studies in classic American literature, because everyone just gets enraptured with D.H. Lawrence's studies in American literature. And she had no idea what cataclysmic confidences she would be plunging into. She read it from cover to cover, underlining, turning down corners in most enthusiastic abandon. And there are exclamation points as well in that copy. Plus, excitement for her reading was not bound to one genre. In fact, it was often academic. And her academic reading and her sort of excitement that she had for language intertwined. So she can be reading something and noting things from critical texts, but then she could also note lines she just likes. The two existed side by side. So in this instance from the Wasteland, She's noting the fact that Eliot was a bit cavalier is not the right word, but he, as you may know, added the endnotes to fill the pages. So he wasn't as immersed in things like the tarot cards as the critics came to interpret. So his notes read a little bit flip, and she flags that. She says quite arbitrarily, and she knew the tarot cards. And when she taught Eliot, she noted to bring in her own tarot card. She also read From Ritual to Romance, another source that he notes and that critics read into the poem, but that he somewhat dismissed. And so in her moment, when she studied The Wasteland and when she studied Eliot with Elizabeth Drew, she wrote in her copy the contents of the notes. And she wrote in her copy quotations from Elizabeth Drew's book on Eliot. So it sort of also presents this moment where it captures her moment of reading The Wasteland, as well as her flagging just the reaction he wanted from people. What do you mean quite arbitrarily? And so she's pointing out that she noticed it, but she's also registering almost like a muted outrage at this. Like, I can't believe that. One other passage that's a bit funnier and meant to be a bit funnier is in her copy of Dostoevsky's Diary of a Writer, which she read as most likely during her preparation for her senior thesis in the fall of 1954. And the passage is in French and then translated. I am undertaking a long journey. If I should not succeed, let people gather to celebrate my resurrection with a bottle of Clicquot. If I should succeed, I ask that I be interred only after I'm altogether dead, since it is very disagreeable to awake in a coffin in the earth. It is not chic. So Plath here, you can see some of the roots of her own humor and playfulness here, and she's registering the joke. But the text could have very well existed without the exclamation point. It's almost as if she adds the punctuation that others did not add, leaving us to see more of her humor in the aftermath. It's like, thank you for showing me your many dimensions. Well, ever since Plath's poems have been published, though, and people have taken her as a very grim person, even though there are moments of humor in, say, the Bell Jar, and then her journals and letters acted as a corrective to that, because people did see that she had a broad sense of humor, as well as other states that she expresses throughout her work. I wanted to take a look at some moments in the restored Ariel to close, because some of you may know the restored Ariel. It was published in 2004, and it was a corrective to Ted Hughes's Ariel by restoring the order that Plath planned to publish Ariel in. But Plath also left her poems somewhat not unfinished, but in a state where they weren't in publication. So they had editing marks on them, mostly for punctuation and largely for exclamation points. 15 of the poems in the restored Ariel, the restored Ariel, half of it is this typescript of the Ariel and other poems manuscript. It's a typescript, but collection. That Plath left, and 15 of them have these canceled exclamation points, and there are 11 in Lady Lazarus. I recounted them last night to make sure. So one thing that to me it signals is that it would have been a different book if it had all those exclamation points. And there's different responses to this. Linda Bunsen, in her book The Other Ariel, thinks it has the effect of muting the poems. And perhaps she had been encouraged to do so, is what Linda Bunsen thinks. One other reading of punctuation that's more recent that I like is by Callista McRae, and she thinks that unpunctuation in poems can have a deadpan effect. She's referring more, though, to unpunctuation as a complete lack, whereas here it becomes another multi-step process akin to that of adding an exclamation point in Plath's time. you see both the exclamation point and its cancellation. You imagine the poem with and without the exclamation point when you see this version. If you read the plain text version of the poem, you would not do this imaginative work, but it adds a sort of another layered process to it. But what she keeps and what she takes out are interesting. She leaves, for instance, a miracle. That needs to jump off the page, whereas the others get toned down a notch. You know, I have done it again versus I have done it again. And this continues throughout. And it may have been taken in a more comedic way too, if some of the sarcasm might have been heightened if more flagged. But she removed a lot of exclamation points. And in Cut, for instance, they're throughout. What a thrill. I mean, in some ways, a thrill doesn't need to be more thrilling, but she had originally thought so. And it's interesting too, because Plath is envisioned as being so grim in that October month that she's writing all of these poems at dawn, but actually she was including a lot of energy in them. And these are some more she cut out. And then in some instances, she reinstated it. And Karen Kukil was among the people who saw this mark as a mark of reinstatement with the dots. And it's interesting because in this instance, it's different from the others we've seen. And it's more complicated. And she almost, this is a longer poem and it's a more serious poem about taking place at the sea. But it's almost as if she feels the need to add energy to it or to add an impact to this line. So I think one of the things we learned from the restored Ariel is that in its act of restoration, it also shows us the way that writing is an ongoing process, even in our attempts to restore and finalize, we realize that writing as a process is ongoing, and that Plath's manuscripts are final, but also show traces of the writing and working process of what Tracy Brain has called. We see what Tracy Brain has called Plath the working writer. So thank you again for this opportunity to explore all of these material facets of Plath's work, from her college room to her typewriters to her exclamation excisions. And I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions.
And please feel free to raise your question. Raise your hand in the raised hand icon.
I'm just seeing all the chat. I hadn't looked yet. So.
Or you can put it in the chat too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, please. Please feel free to raise your hand.
Or we'll just call on people randomly. We'll start with Australia and work all around the world.
Oh, there's a new. Oh, I thought maybe there was a new question. Oh,
there's a question.
Thank you. I'm wondering if Plath had any other physical elements to writing as she did with her typewriter. I'm sure, many. I'm not sure where to go with physical elements. But I mean, she liked to use black ink, for instance. She had a particular pen she often used. It may be the one visible in the first slide we saw. Her letters and journals are sort of filled with descriptions. Like when she taught, she said she liked teaching in particular rooms. She liked to pick books by their texture. So she was somewhat, the physicality of things was not lost on her. Carrie Johnson, how did the past sense of being a woman relate to all that pink? I think there was definitely a femininity to it. In 1957, there was a film called Funny Face with the song Think Pink. I think that was after, but I think it was really something intertwined with the magazine culture of the time too, and sort of a very standard image of femininity that would have probably drawn her to the paper.
There's a question about the earthenware head, and people can also ask the question out loud if they choose to. We don't want to deprive, especially women, of their voices.
She did leave the head in the tree. She did. It's in the poem too, that way.
Oh, and you were telling us something about the earthenware head, the version that's at Harvard.
There is a version at Harvard.
Yeah.
The earthenware head, she writes to Jack Sweeney that she was sending it, and she calls it the earthenware head. In the collected poems, it is called The Lady and the Earthenware Head.
And you were saying it might be, are we allowed to say?
Well, it comes after the poem in the collected poems because that version was not available to them at the time. That's
they were assembling that. Oh, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when they were working on the collected poems, there are collected poems working papers at Smith, and they did not have the version that's at Harvard because she had sent it to Jack Sweeney, and they didn't know it was there. They had her version that she had included in her Cambridge manuscript that had the title The Lady and the Earthenware Head. But it's interesting because in her letter, she dropped the lady, and that's what the typescript has at Harvard.
I mean, I could show a typescript. Somebody is asking what her handwriting looked like. I mean, we do have some.
Oh, if you Google
I can also show the real container. Do you have some you could show, Amanda?
Oh, the real container. But if you Google Plath British Library, you'll get that outline that I mentioned with her handwriting on it. She did write extended comments, and you can read about it in my book, Annotating Modernism. She wrote so much in her books. Her copy of Ulysses is one of the most fascinating. Some of her books, like Ulysses, she was writing commentary that came out of her professor's lectures and such, but then also sometimes she's just writing things like exquisitely grotesque. So she varied as an annotator. She was intense consistently, intense in different ways, drawing on different sources. Her poems, prose, and creative pieces were typed. Sometimes her journal passages were typed too on loose pages. And her letters, when you read the letters, you can see at the top whether it was an ALS or a TLS, which means an autographed letter signed or a typed letter signed. I have read Red Comet and I loved it. Oh, John Sweeney, not Jack Sweeney. I was thinking of you.
I'd like to thank you for, I maintained my youth over these centuries. I'm the great unborn love child of Jack Sweeney.
I have so many questions for you, John Jack Sweeney.
Sylvia and I had a very intense benevolence. So I wanted to know about D.H. Lawrence, and I know from the little reading I've done that she was pretty big on a lot of Lawrence, and your marginalia there about that little book that she read in a flash, and later some of her ideas about women that Lawrence was quite unpopular for later. Did you find any other, I love this stuff, marginalia about Lawrence or in Lawrence, in Women in Love or anything? Did she write that stuff in the margins, and could you tell early on that she had an affinity for some of his ideas? Or
she loved Lawrence, and this was before the vilification of him.
Yeah, I know.
And
she's always ahead of her time.
Several Lawrence books that there's several at Smith, there's one at Emory. She read Sons and Lovers and Women in Love and the Rain. Well, not all of the Rainbow. She read In the Rainbow. Also books like Aaron's Rod, the Plumaged Serpent, and a few others, and his poems and his stories. She taught his stories. And so, but Women in Love in particular, she does not write in the margins, she underlines. Same with Sons and Lovers, she writes sporadically. There's one page of it you can find online from a Smith exhibit where she actually identified a moment that Karen Kukil identified as being from, Plath wrote, I think in that one she wrote July 1953. There's a series of passages that I talk about in my book where Plath wrote different months in 1953 because she was finding these passages that sort of were akin to what she ends up capturing as her own moments while she was having her breakdown. And so one of them is the moment when Paul's mother dies at the end. Is that, yes, if I remember it correctly. But she loved Lawrence, and Lawrence is a very different writer than, say, Virginia Woolf, who she also loves, and she draws them into contrasts. Very different. But she didn't take him to task, and she didn't see as much political interest in him, though she did attend the Lady Chatterley trial, and she writes notes about it in her diary. So that was, in that she did note some of the political dimensions, but not so much as like Lawrence socialism and such. She did not comment on that.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I could talk all day about Lawrence. Well, another time.
Can I ask a question about
Oh,
Lawrence?
hi,
too?
Sarah. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming all this way.
Just curious if she had kangaroo in her collection.
Yes,
Obviously,
kangaroos
obviously.
at Emory. That's what I was like. The kangaroos at Emory, and I think there are exclamation points. If you Google around, there was a little piece about it when they first acquired the library. Oh yes, she
Okay.
did. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's a research trip for another day.
Yeah. I can take you to where he lived.
I can share just the image of the real container with her handwriting on it. And I can actually share one of the typescripts briefly. We'd probably just have to remove it from the footage of this video. But did anyone want to see her handwriting to answer your question? I think I can do it from the real container. So this is the container, the liner notes that she created for, I think it was her second recording actually with us. Let me just see if I can find it. Let's see if this is it. Can everyone see that? So would you like to narrate this, Amanda?
Oh, go ahead. No, I'm good.
Sure. So this was, as you can see, the Facet Recording Studio tag on the bottom. Stephen Facet made this recording in Chestnut, on Chestnut Street at his studio. He also made the first recording of Audre Lorde, Sun Ra, etc. So I mean, he was a extraordinary, and Sexton. But these, as far as we know, are her pencil liner notes. You can see her handwriting is sort of almost looks like. I love that what you were talking about, her identity as a student. I was actually thinking that that whole concept could in ways displace this idea of academia overtaking poets if instead of them thinking of themselves as professors, we thought ourselves as the curious students. I mean, there's something radical about that status. But anyway, the handwriting to me it was so revelatory when I first saw it. And again, sort of displaced some of the narratives I'd heard about her, especially that wondrous drawing. Can you say anything? Can you analyze anything about that drawing?
Peter Steinberg would like to.
Let's have Peter do it.
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear
Always
me?
better.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Peter.
Okay. I can't really talk about the doodle, but what I can say is that when I first started at the Woodbury Poetry Room, we were digitizing a lot of these old reel-to-reels, and the Plath was one that was selected for the two Plath ones that you have, because she'd annotated the other one as well.
We have
The process of digitizing meant that the original containers were often thrown away. And I saved these two from being thrown away because I recognized that Plath had written on them. So that's
I
why they're
believe a
saved.
lot of data was lost from
Yeah,
whoever made that decision. So we're
yeah. So
so
that was a
grateful.
bad decision, but I was happy to sort of save them. Okay, bye.
Bye, Peter.
There are a few small things that are neat, like in addition to the baby head, is that what you all see? There's also the beggar of Benidorm Market is interesting because that's a title she changed to the beggars. I thought it was the beggars of Benidorm Market. There's a typescript where she crosses out the second part, but it's interesting because you could date that change from before.
Okay, I'll stop the share. I just wanted you to be able to see her hand.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you.
Have you ever typed on an old Royal or any of those type of things yourself?
The students have, and I sort of I did use a typewriter in my use, but it was electric. But I'm a bit intimidated by Plath's typewriter. But students at Smith do, and they often, as part of their classes in their book room, and they remember it. And when I meet students and I say what I do, they say, "Did you see the typewriter?" It's really an amazing thing about Smith, the way students are able to learn about Plath's material practices.
Any other questions, or we usually end our events with just a little music and then sign off, but
Oh, Susanna has a question. Susanna?
Susanna, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. It was so wonderful to have this presentation, especially as I read through Red Comet. Will this recording be posted for reviewing?
yes, we make these recordings for our archive and we share them publicly. So,
Thank you.
of course. I see a comment from Frida. I don't know her last name. Do you see that one? It's in the Zoom chat. Someone else's mic is, oh, sorry, Sarah Burton has raised her hand again. And she is from Australia, so we did promise that Australia.
I am just wondering, it's a little bit of a side note, but if Amanda, you could talk a little bit, and I think if Karen's still here as well, about the project that you're doing with Faber, the collection about that for Plath, and how you imagine this kind of stuff will augment that. If you want to share a little bit about that.
If Karen would like to join, that's great. I mean, I could say that it's been 40 years since the first book. So as you know, there's been so many discoveries in the past 40 years from the journals and the letters and all of the scholarship. So much of the work is reckoning with all of this material in a good way. And I've also come to have enormous respect for the editors of the first volume. You have no idea what this is like until you start doing it. And I find it really fascinating to go through their working papers as I see them or Olwen probably asking these questions that I wondered what she did there, and sort of seeing all this, making it more of a conversation, an analog or past conversation that we're able to engage with. It's a huge honor.
I wonder, in that light, I was thinking about your use of social media. I'm just thinking about technology and our different modes even now. Like, in some ways, I feel like you've created an access to this experience, to this process in some ways through that through social media. I was just wondering if you wanted to talk about how you use social media in some ways to punctuate the experience of compiling or doing that work. It can be lonely work, and just how it accompanies you and how that technology has kind of opened up a conversation around Plath.
Well, one of the best things about social media, and this is like throughout the pandemic and throughout academic life, is it gives you company. I think as an academic, I've met so many people that way. And I think I've made friendships with people and kept in contact with people that way. And so it gives you a sense of academic community. I don't know if Karen would like to chime in at all, but no pressure.
No, you've said it all, Amanda.
Thank you. And oh, I forgot to show, I had a page of acknowledgements at the end of my talk, and it thanked, well, I'll just thank everyone now that I thanked Christina and Mary and Peter and Karen and Faber and the Plath Estate and Smith College Special Collections and English Department, and my own institution, New York Institute of Technology.
So we could wrap with the song we've chosen to celebrate the paperback emergence of annotating modernism.
Yes, out this year.
Could you hold it up?
Yes, and today also the Bloomsbury Handbook to Sylvia Plath, which
Oh,
I
that's the one that
edited
came out. Mhm.
with Anita Hella and Maeve O'Brien. It's due out in hardcover and on April 21st, but today Bloomsbury released it on its own platform. So if your library subscribes to Bloomsbury Collections, it was released today, which is very exciting news.
Okay, we're going to play a brief tune and then you can either sign off or people can linger briefly afterwards. So here we go. This is in honor of Amanda's
And paperbacks everywhere.
paperback.
Paperback writer.